Hey y'all, this is the first Menace Sidebar. Welcome back. So, even though this is technically a completely different project, I'm calling this season 4 because it's an extension of the original Keepsake Box series. Before we get into it, I wanted to address a couple of things. First, I hope this isn't too offsetting. To address the elephant in the room, Ken is a guy, and I'm obviously not a guy. I keep wondering if it's strange hearing me read a guy's story in my voice. I asked somebody today, and they told me that it wasn't really strange. It was just like me narrating it. I don't know what y'all think. Anyway, thing 2. I mentioned this in the final Keepsake Box sidebar, and it's official now that I'm recording. Man, Ken curses like a sailor. We, Chinney, Shandora, and Simone, do not curse. Navigating through that has been crazy. I'm working through it though, so let's get started. First, this project is set up a little differently. Every once in a while, an episode is going to be introduced by a preface. This is done for the purpose of emphasis. When this happens, it'll be something that will be impactful. Episode 1 opens with a preface, but it's one that will come into play a little later down the line. To quote, it says, "Life ain't ever been fair for me. And the fact that I was hard-headed probably didn't help." Correction. Let's go back, because that's not what it says. It says, "Life ain't ever been easy for me. And the fact that I was hard-headed probably didn't help. From the outside looking in, it's easy to say that I should have made different decisions, and maybe I should have. But this is something that a lot of people don't realize. You don't always choose your life. Sometimes your life chooses you." Ken. Episode 1. Not the Cosbys. Episode 1 introduces us to Ken's family structure. We find out that he grew up with both parents in the house, but it wasn't a very stable family unit. His parents met when his dad went to the grocery store where his mom worked to buy cigarettes. He struck up a conversation and got her phone number, even though he had another woman waiting outside in the car for him. He started being a nigga real early. Ma was 19 and already had Kendrick, aka Kenny. It never says how old Pops was, and I'm going to be honest, I don't think I've ever thought about it either way. Anyway, Pops moves into Ma's apartment, even though it was against the rules, and Ken was born shortly thereafter. This is where Ken introduces himself as Ken Matthews and puts emphasis on the fact that his name is spelled with all capital letters. That's important to note because, if you remember, that's how he introduced himself to Shalonda in the Keepsake Box. But now you realize that there was some dysfunction attached to it because Pops only did that to make sure that he was preferential to Kenny since Kenny wasn't biologically his son. Kenny was only 2 when the parents met and 3 at the time of Ken's birth. So you realize that this man was on some mess from the very beginning. And straight out of the gate, he starts the process of treating Ken differently than he treats Kenny. Episode 1 is also when we start to realize that Pops is not a contributor to the household. Ma is struggling to pay the bills and Pops doesn't work. Not only does he not work, but she can't even depend on him to keep the kids while she's at work. Ken recounts an instance when Pops was supposed to be keeping them and Kenny somehow managed to get out of the house. Somebody called the police. Pops was able to climb back into a window and say that he had fallen asleep, but Ma later found out that he was with another woman and left the kids unattended. Ma fights the lady. Between the fight, Pops illegally living in the apartment, and the Child Protective Services investigation, they end up losing the apartment. This happens several times over the years, but Ma always manages to let Pops come back into the situation. Meanwhile, when Ken was 5, Pops gets Celia pregnant, the woman that was in the car when they met. And because Pops was a nigga, he actually expected Ma to take the baby, Adrian, to the babysitter that she was paying for. Boy. We also find out that Pops can't read well in this episode, something that Ma seems to capitalize on. To even everything out, Pops marries Ma, but he doesn't change a thing. Episode 2, Levels. As the title indicates, this episode talks about the escalation in Pops' behavior. Basically, he only had to do something one time, and after he dealt with the consequences of having done it, not only was he going to do it again, but he was going to escalate his behavior. To prove that point, Ken points out some examples of Pops taking things further and further. For instance, it wasn't enough to just cheat. He had to cheat and get Celia pregnant. It wasn't enough to just leave out for a few hours after Ma got home from work. Eventually, he started staying out all night. It wasn't enough to stay out all night and make Ma have to catch a ride to work in the morning. At some point, he'd just stay out for the entire day, and she'd have to catch a ride home from work as well. Then he started staying out for consecutive days. And the crazy thing about it is, he was real uncaring about it all. He was all like, "What do you want me to do, Trisha?" Like he couldn't help it or something. It was never really mentioned, but this dude had to be fine. Like, for real. Jody ain't got no job. He won't keep the kids. He can't read. He can't do nothing but cheat. There was obviously something about this man. Maybe he was doing that thing. I don't know. But anyway, at some point, Pops levels up in a way that really changes the family's dynamic. Now, I don't agree with any gender putting their hands on the other. Gotta put that out there. So, Mom was out of place forever being the initiator in all the other instances. But to that point, Pops had let Mom get away with it because he knew he was always messing up. But like I said, all he had to do was do something one time and it was officially a pattern of behavior. So he stays out all night. It doesn't say in the story, but Mom probably put her hands on him because that was typically how things went. But that time, Pops didn't let her get away with it. Ken and Kenny came into the bedroom to find Pops sitting on top of Mom, punching her in the face. Kenny jumps into action and distracts Pops enough for Mom to get up. And this is when the dysfunction between Pops and Kenny starts brewing. After Mom tells Pops to get out, he pushes Kenny down on his way out. Sidebar. Because I don't curse, I altered the verbiage. In the podcast, Mom said, "Get out with your illiterate self." In the book, she calls him an illiterate B word. I'm just telling y'all that for dramatics. But anyway, Ken and Kenny were 10 and 13 when that happened. Ma and Pop started fighting regularly, and Kenny was always in the middle of it. We really start to see a little bit of Kenny's personality start to emerge. Kenny was 13 at that point, and he was a protector. It's obvious that he was willing to stand up to Pops in instances where he put his hands on Ma. But Ken also states that none of the neighborhood boys would mess with him because they were all scared of Red Kenny, which ends up being a nickname for Kenny. This is so because he was described as being really light-skinned with greenish gray eyes. And y'all know black people will give somebody a nickname. Anyway, Kenny had started to establish himself as a bit of a bully. We also realized that Kenny was the one who was always into something. He's the one that goes into the parents' bedroom and finds a crack in the drawer. Now it makes sense that he was the one that got out when they were little and Pops had to climb in through the window and act like he was home the whole time. It also makes sense that he was the one that called out the fact that the car wasn't there the first time that Pops didn't come home. Basically, we're kind of starting to notice the dynamics of their relationship as brothers. Anyway, they found crack in their parents' bedroom, so they started watching them for crackhead signs. But they gave them the benefit of the doubt by saying maybe they were just keeping it for somebody. Episode 3. It got real. They were not keeping the crack for somebody else. This becomes obvious because Pops always manages to level up. Basically, he breaks his leg, which forces him to sell crack out of the house. Sidebar. The conversation between Ma and Grandma is hilarious to me. In the podcast episode, Grandma says that Pops was out with an old heifer for 2 days. And now the heifer then broke his leg. In the book, she blatantly calls the lady the B word, which is hilarious to me because I can imagine an old church lady doing that all while listening to gospel music. Anyway, Pops can't get around, so people start coming to the house to buy crack. It's up in the air whether Ma knew what he was doing. She says, "I know you ain't doing that stuff around my kids, Chris." She says the actual S word in the book, but I say stuff in the podcast. It's unclear whether she's referring to him selling drugs altogether or him doing it in front of the kids. Either way, you know he only had to do it once. Then it was officially the thing. And because it was out in the open, the kids start getting exposed to stuff that they shouldn't ever see. They start meeting crazy characters like Mailbox Mike, Pee Pants Pam, and Nikki that fell off the fence. And while that's funny, they also get exposed to the grimier side of things, like crackheads breaking into their apartment, people showing up, and even trying to climb in through their window in the middle of the night. Mom continues to get in the hole because she's still the sole provider, but Pops has introduced variables into their lives that take away from the situation, even though he's not contributing to it. And if all of that wasn't bad enough, this dude get caught smoking crack in the house. Episode 4, The Element of Surprise. So, Pops is a part-time drug dealer and a part-time drug user. But like Ken says, that's a hard fence to straddle. Eventually, you got to pick a side. And Pops was probably a better crack smoker than he was a crack dealer. And because of that, he got beat up. The family was minding their business, eating dinner, when the door flung open. Two men burst in with guns. One of them asked, "Got my money, Chris?" Chris, a.k.a. Pops, was like, "You said Friday, Rob." Based on the story, we know it's Wednesday. Why he decided to show up early to collect, we don't know. I just needed for him to get beat up for dramatics. But what we do know is Ken and Ma were all to pieces, crying and such. Kenny, who was like 14 or 15 at the time, watched the man that he had been around since he was 2 and called his Pops get pistol whipped. He never even stopped eating. Behind Pop's back, Kenny started calling him Crackhead Chris. Things were escalating in the household. Mom and Pops were still fighting, Pops was still cheating, and the crackheads were still breaking into the house. The only thing that was really solid was the relationship between Ken and Kenny. This is the point where Kenny really starts to assert himself into Big Brother energy. It's at this point where he starts pouring into Ken and making sure that he understands that they're all they have. But this is the thing. Ken doesn't believe in himself in the same way that Kenny does. He knows that Kenny is his protector, but he hasn't ever had to protect Kenny. He wonders why Kenny trusts him so much. By that point, the boys are 12 and 15. Ken says that Kenny is a full-blown menace, a 6'2", 190-pound, green-eyed devil. He was getting into trouble in every way imaginable. He's 15. He dropped out of school, and in spite of the fact that Pops hadn't ever worked a day in his life, he told Kenny that he had to get a job if he wasn't going to be in school, like he was taking care of him anyway. Kenny said, "Nigga, you get a job." Kenny did not get a job. What he did do was start selling crack. And if all the people that he could have scored from, he decided to score from Rob, the dude that beat Pops up at the kitchen table. Kenny got real close to Rob too, and they got real disrespectful together. Rob started treating Kenny like a son, taking him to football games and such. He started showing up and just being like, "Tell Kenny to come on." And Kenny was just walking past Pops without asking permission, like to leave it and everything. He was like 16. And when that got old, Rob bought Kenny a car and told him to tell Pops that he couldn't drive it. Imagine that. Meanwhile, Kenny and Ken started a routine of spending Wednesdays together. Episode 5. And they did that to make sure that they didn't get too disconnected from each other. Episode 5, Respect. In this episode, Kenny starts to counsel Ken about respect. And those are moments that he'll be able to reflect on in the future. To quote, Kenny says, "Ken, you want to know why I do what I do? Because what you do matters. You just have to decide who is worth mattering to. There are a lot of people out here that think I ain't worth nothing, and I might not be to them, but I matter to the ones I want to matter to. Respect me, and that's enough for me." That quote will play a huge part in Ken's life. Ken realizes in this episode that there were very important moments in life where he connects with because they change the dynamics of respect. Included were Celia's pregnancy, Pops not coming home, Pops hitting Ma, Pops smoking crack, Rob beating Pops up, and Kenny coming home with that car. All of those situations made Ken feel some kind of way about Pops, but he still felt connected to him in the same way that he felt connected to Ma, unlike Kenny. But Pops does something in episode 5 that completely changes that. Ken and Kenny come home one Wednesday and Pops is high. Kenny immediately connects the dots and goes to check his money stash outside. And that nigga Pops then took the whole thing. It was a little over $3,000. And when Kenny tells Pops that he's gonna pay him back the money, Pops tells him to leave the house. We got to keep in mind that he was high though. I mean, obviously really high because he stole $3,000. I don't know. How much crack does $3,000 get you? Maybe he stole it over time because it seems like $3,000 is a whole lot of money to spend on crack while somebody's gone on a Wednesday afternoon. I don't know because I've never smoked crack. So I don't know. Y'all let me know. But anyway, Kenny goes off because he realized that Pops is living off a situation that his grandparents created. And when he tried to put money aside to fix the house, Pops was selfish enough to steal it, even though he has not contributed to the family unit at all. You can tell that he really wants Ma to step up in this situation, but she's broken over her mother's passing, and she just really doesn't want to deal with it. She's like, y'all cut this mess out. So Kenny decides to leave, even though he knows he doesn't have to. Ken is hot, and he loses a lot of respect for Pops. At that point, Kenny has nothing to do with Pops, and whenever he's referenced, Kenny says, F Pops. Yeah, he says the F word in the book. Episode 6, May 26, 1993. Episode 6 has a preface because the episode is impactful in some way. That will become a running theme in this season. This preface states, I was no longer fearful of anything. One thing that I've learned is that fear is about loss. When you fear something, it's because you know you have something to lose. I felt like I had lost everything. And if I didn't have anything else to lose, then I didn't have anything else to fear, which is something that Ken ends up saying in this episode. Sidebar. Shandora did a lot of research for this episode. See, y'all know I'm a researcher because I like for things to be credible. For this episode, I needed for this thing to happen in a very specific way and on a very specific day. It had to. And let me tell y'all, this thing hurt me to my heart. I mean, I was crying real life sensitive thug tears. I connect to these characters like I know them in real life. Like, I know what they look like in everything. I told my family group chat about it, and they made me send them a picture because I told them I was crying. I got joked on real bad. But anyway, I've been asked a few times why this happened if it was so painful to me. This is the thing. There was never a plan to do anything outside of the original Keepsake Box series. So I dropped things in those books that just padded to the story. Just padded the story. One of those things was Shalonda listing a few things that she and Ken had talked about. He told her about his parents and about their situations. And he also opened up about seeing his brother get killed. And because that got dropped in book 1 of the Keepsake Box series, it had to happen. But it didn't just have to happen. It had to happen in a way that was super impactful for Ken. Also, because of some things related to the Keepsake Box, it was important for me to have this happen on a Wednesday. So that's how May 26, 1993 came about. In my research, I realized that Menace to Society came out on that date, and it was actually a Wednesday. That was completely on point for what logically would have been going on in Ken and Kenny's life. Wednesday was their day, so it just made sense. Also, Kenny was a bit of a menace, so it made sense that he would choose for that to be their Wednesday activity. I could see him being really into that movie. I love that movie too, by the way. Also, there were some weird glitches that I caught in the playback of that episode, but I let them go because I did. Anyway, Wednesday, May 26, 1993. Ken skips school to hang out with Kenny. They go to the mall where Kenny breaks some things down about girls. This quote will also become impactful for Ken. He says, we're young, and we have a long time before we need to be settling down. But this is the trick. Every girl you deal with got to know their place with you. That's how you keep it from getting messy. If you meet a girl and you just want to sleep with her, don't promise her anything other than that. If that ain't enough for her, let her walk. You can replace her. You ain't got enough energy to treat all of them good. But if you find somebody that's worth it, treat her better than you've ever treated anybody else. You ain't even got to be faithful to her, but make her feel like she's the most important thing to you and she's going to return the favor. He was an arrogant little twerp too. But anyway, after leaving the mall, they go to the movies to see Menace to Society. As expected, Kenny eats that movie up. He's wearing a brand new white Nautica t-shirt because it's 1993. So he won't even let Ken get extra butter. He doesn't want to mess his shirt up. They leave the movies and go out to their little dirt path to smoke. And then it's time to go home. Time is such a horrible thing sometimes. For the purposes of this project, Kenny had to need gas. It had to be a Wednesday, so Ken had to be with him. But in the real world, one has to wonder if things could have been different if he hadn't stopped for gas. I mean, it had to happen, but couldn't it happen on a Thursday when Ken was at school? Why did he have to be there to see it? For this project, he needed to. All of it needed to happen. Anyway, they go to the store, and Kenny comes out with some watermelon drinks that Ma likes. Some guy walks up to him and asks if he's read Kenny. Old dude pulls out a gun, which prompts Ken to get out of the car. Kenny, always being unrattled, tries to talk his way out of it, thinking he's just going to get robbed. He's like, "Hey man, I can get my homeboy to put you on so you ain't got to do this." And the guy tells him it's bigger than that. He says, "This is for Tony," and starts shooting. In the book, Ken yells out, "What the F did you do?" And the guy looks confused, like he ain't do it. But in the short version, Ken gets onto the ground and begs Kenny not to die. But he looks into his eyes and realizes that it's too late. Y'all, I was crying like a baby. His crisp white Nautica shirt that he didn't want to get butter on was saturated in his blood. Ken looks up at a sign in the parking lot. It was one of those signs that alternates between the price of a gallon of gas and the date and time. He looks up just in time to see May 26, 1993, 7:26 p.m., and that's when Kenny died. I was stammering over my words when I was recording that because I was about to cry. My heart was so heavy, y'all. Even in the days leading up to this, I started feeling physically heavy because I knew it was going to happen. While I was writing this, somebody asked me how I felt like that if I knew it was coming. The answer is probably weirder than you might think. So I write really freeform. I'll have an idea in my mind, but the surrounding details don't happen until I start writing them. So I knew Kenny was going to die because he had to die. But I didn't know that Ken was going to be in the parking lot screaming like that. The same was true for Kenny's funeral. He died, so he obviously had to have a funeral. I knew that I wanted it to be that following Wednesday because that day was and will continue to be impactful throughout the story. What I didn't know was how Mom was going to be standing in front of that casket, falling and like sobbing and falling down like wet noodles, or how they both lay in front of the casket or at the burial site. Those things literally hit my mind as I'm writing, and I'm extremely visual, so I play this stuff out in my mind. Like I can literally close my eyes and see it, and it's like a gut punch. It feels super heavy. I absolutely understand why actors start getting connected to the characters they play, like when Heath Ledger said that playing the Joker made him feel depressed. It's a creative thing. I'm telling y'all, it's crazy. Anyway, after the funeral, Ken took the time to really look at Kenny's obituary. In doing that, he realized that Pops wasn't even listed as his father. Even though Ken knew that he wasn't his biological father, this really bothered him. He understood that all Kenny ever wanted was to be accepted by Pops. And after everything that he had done to Kenny, he couldn't even give him that. He had already made a difference between the two of them, constantly thrown verbal jabs at him, fist fought him, and kicked him out after he stole from him. And after he died, he didn't even acknowledge him as his son, and he had been in his life since he was 2. Kenny was 18 when he died. For Ken, that was the straw that broke the camel's back. Additionally, Ken felt that Kenny likely got killed because he was selling drugs. And he felt that he may have made other decisions if Pops had been the man that he was supposed to be. He realized that he wouldn't ever see Pops the same. He also realized that there was a hole that needed to be filled. Kenny was gone, so somebody needed to step up and take care of the family. That got decided for him on May 23rd, 1993 at 7:26 p.m. So that's it for this sidebar. The next episode is titled Failure. Kenny really starts to see the effects of Kenny's death. And some surprising things happen as a result of that. We'll let some more build up, and we'll talk about it on the next sidebar with Chinney. Thank you so much for listening. Please follow me on Facebook and Instagram. I'd love to hear from you. If you'd like to purchase books by Shandora Warren, they're all available on Amazon in ebook, paperback, and some in hardback formats. Please like and follow this podcast, and feel free to share it with your friends, family, and frenemies, because all relationships matter, even the toxic ones. Thanks so much for helping me to create the world that I want to see. Oh yeah, you're welcome. Shine, little girl.